Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Excellent. Welcome. First of all, let me say, Hala Esfandiari wanted to be here, but she was taken ill yesterday. Nothing serious. Hopefully she'll be on the mend very quickly. And good morning to Joe and Alma Gildenhorn. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, living memorial to our 28th president, the only president with a PhD, and the only one buried in Washington, D.C. The latter is a very interesting historical fact, which probably reflects the relationship between our presidents and the cities in which they worked and lived for quite a while. But the only one. This morning we're delighted to have Dan Schueftan back with us again. Dan's bio you have. I should only say that he's both a scholar and an analyst and an iconoclast. I like iconoclasts, breakers of icons, because challenging the conventional wisdom is sometimes perceived as annoyingly negative. Sometimes there are darker motives attached, but I think it's really, really, really important, particularly today and particularly in the Middle East, to acknowledge that certain realities that we have all accepted over the years may not have played out in precisely the way many of us would have hoped and wanted them to play out. Now, challenging these realities doesn't make the unconventional wisdom true or the new conventional wisdom, but it is really, really important. Because unless you examine the assumptions and the realities on which the United States is basing its policies, particularly for the great power, you end up in a situation where the great power ends up making policy based on the world the way it wants, the way it wants the world to be, rather than the way the world really is. And I would argue to you that good policy in this very uncertain, unpredictable, and imperfect world is always based on finding the balance between the way the world is on one hand and the way we all want it to be on the other. Nobody gets 100% in life on most any dimension of the human enterprise. And that's certainly true when it comes to American foreign policy in the Middle East. Dan is going to talk about the relationship between Europe and Israel. I'd only point out that the U.S.-Israeli relationship, by comparison, is a simple matter to understand and to set in perspective. We're one country. Europe is many. Our history and involvement with Israel is brief. The Europeans have been at this for a long, long time. And the complexity of those relationships, we lacked. Britain and France were mandatory powers. Europe is much closer to the region. The Europeans have played a colonial role with respect to this region in a traditional sense, while we have not. And the Europeans have even involved the Israelis in their own colonial schemes. Witness Suez in 1956. So it's a much more complex relationship, but an important one. So with that in mind, Dan, welcome once again to the center. And we're all going to be very interested in what you have to say.
Thank you. Well, since most of the presentation this morning will be about problems and negative issues, let me start with two positive remarks so that we start on a somewhat different note. First of all, I think that most Israelis would agree that the values that Israelis are proud of, we've learned from Europe. And there is a tremendous respect for Europe in terms of its culture, in terms of its values. There are very serious doubts, and I'll speak about it later, about the ability of Europe to defend these values, not only now, but also in the past. But there is a profound understanding that there is something in Europe that you must really appreciate, that you can learn a lot from, that you can respect very much. And I think this extends also to the European project, to the establishment of the European Union, to going beyond wars into more cooperation. And again, that we can still learn a lot from Europe. Another thing, the second positive note, is that when you come to the bilateral relationship between Israel and most European countries, they're basically good. Most European governments are either friendly or fair-minded. There is only a very small number of countries who are unfriendly, sometimes bordering on hostile. There is a very high level of interaction, economic interaction. There are many friends that Israel has in Europe. So this is the broader setting in which I would like to present what I consider to be a structural problem. In other words, I don't think that we have a crisis. I don't think that it is a question of a policy, and it is certainly not a product exclusively or even primarily of the occupation or the idea that Europeans want a different kind of settlement with the Palestinians. You need to look at it much more deeper, and I would argue that the problem that we have with Europe is cultural. There is a major problem with a profound difference in the political ethos, and it is rooted very deeply in cultural identity of Israelis and Europeans, or what Europeans are becoming, as seen from an Israeli point of view. And this is poisoning the relationship on the bilateral level and creating very serious problems that, in my view, will only get worse. Also, so that there's no expectation towards the end of my presentation, I don't think that any of the parties will change their basic attitude. I don't think that they have a motivation to change it, and they have a very strong motivation not to change it. I'll discuss it towards the end of my presentation. So the problem is very serious. And I think it is very helpful to look at the difference between American-Israeli relations and Israeli-European relations in order to understand some of these difficulties, because I would argue that when it comes to open societies, the cultural dimension in the final analysis is as potent, in some cases even more potent, than common economic or strategic interests. The cultural element is always underestimated, and I think we can try to do it some justice today in this presentation. When you look at the United States, you will find that because there is such common ethos, even when you have an unfriendly administration, and even if you have an administration, and we only had one like that in the United States since the Second World War, that is worse than unfriendly vis-a-vis Israel, and even when you have a confrontation with the President of the United States, nevertheless, the ethos is so strong, the commonality of ethos is so deep, that in the final analysis, the relationship between Israel and the United States are getting better consistently since the 1960s. In Europe, on the other hand, in spite of very strong bilateral interests, bilateral relations based on a common interest, the conflicting ethos makes it very difficult and increasingly more difficult, and the European collective makes it much more difficult to deal with these issues than the European bilateral relations between Israel and every single European country. Now, let me identify and perhaps separate this particular element from three others that are there, but I don't think are crucial. They should be considered, but I think they're less important than the one that I'm about to discuss in more detail. Of course, there can be in Europe, and there is in Europe, anger about Israeli policies that are counterproductive to European interests, and very often Europeans believe are also counterproductive to Israeli interests. So there is a genuine disagreement, a legitimate disagreement on the question of policy, and it's there. The second element, which is more important, but yet by far not the most important, there is a strong anti-Semitic element in Europe that is percolating into the mainstream. It is not the most important, but I wouldn't disregard it. And the third is the rise in Europe of an Arab and Muslim electorate that has an impact on policy. All these three things are there, but they're not the essence, and you can deal with them more easily than you can with the fundamental issues that I'm about to discuss here in greater detail. The real problem is in the zeitgeist of Europe today, the European ethos today, the way it was molded since the First World War, and these elements very much increased and were strengthened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And when you look at this attitude, this ethos, this zeitgeist in Europe, on the one hand, and the Israeli vital interests, I don't mean some secondary interest that you can say, okay, if you want good relations with Europe, then perhaps it's more important to have them than to pursue these interests. I'm speaking literally of vital interests that Israel has in a very violent environment vis-a-vis mobilized societies and sometimes, in the extreme cases, barbaric regimes in the Middle East. These elements conflict with what Europeans believe need to be the world order. And let me try to focus on the major issues here where Israelis and Europeans disagree. First of all, the use of force, but not just the use of force, but the use of deterrent force. Israel can exist thanks to deterrence. Without a very strong deterrence, Israel would live in permanent war, and the Israeli society cannot take it. So deterrence is really a vital interest. And the use of force for deterrence purposes is different than any other use of force because it must be disproportionate. If it is proportionate, it is not deterrent. I will explain it in a moment. The second point is the Israeli complete disbelief in what in Europe is very central, namely this idea of let us have a dialogue between people who are symmetric. We can consider them symmetrically. They are just one like the other, so let's have a fair dialogue between it. If you don't have a lot of power backing up this kind of dialogue, it is a very serious problem for Israel. Europeans look at the Middle East, look at Israel, look at Israel's attitude to the Arab world, among other things, because of the need to establish deterrence. And what they see in their eyes is a colonial behavior on the part of Israel. And the Europeans identify, and I think identify correctly, the contempt that Israelis have vis-a-vis something that the Europeans consider to be extremely important, namely what the so-called international community, reflected primarily in the United States, in the United Nations. If you look at the Israeli perspective of these issues, and you deal with each and every one of them, you will see that from an Israeli point of view, it is absolutely vital to do things that from a European point of view are considered unacceptable. Let me look at the issue of deterrence, and this is, I think, one of the most important in terms of its ramifications to other parts of the relationship. If you don't have a constantly maintained and very high level of deterrence, Israel cannot survive in this region. This was perhaps difficult to understand until 3 years ago. I think it is much more easy to understand it today. If you look at the reality in the region, look at Syria, at Iraq, at Lebanon, at what's happening throughout the Arab world, I think today it is a bit easier to understand it. And if you don't bring in a kind of response to provocations and violence that is very strong and very humiliating, not only hurting the other side, but also humiliating the other side, saying, if you will provoke us and you will draw us into a violent confrontation, not only will you not succeed, but you will be defeated in a way that will humiliate you. If you don't have it, if they're not afraid of these two elements, you cannot have an effective you cannot have an effective deterrence. Israel needs to space out wars. If you look at the Middle East, I don't think the option of not having wars is even there. The idea is that you have deterrence and then wars are not there. The motivation is so strong, and if you look at how Arabs deal with other Arabs, with the problems that they have, the idea is that one day, or at least soon in the foreseeable future, there will be no wars. That's not an option. But you need to space out wars by deterrence, and if you don't, you cannot build the Israeli society. And Israel is not about defeating Arabs. It is about building the Israeli society. And if you need to do it, you cannot do it on the basis of proportionality in the magnitude of your response, because from an Arab point of view, living in an acceptable level of violence is what they do every day anyway in their own societies and between themselves. So they can live with it for a very long time. Israelis cannot. So you must do it in a way that will not be proportional in the magnitude, but it will be proportional to the damage that they can cause us by using violence against us. So you need to be responding in a way that will be perceived inevitably in Europe as being disproportionate. Otherwise, there is no deterrence. Dialogue is a very good idea. We have in Israel a joke on the subject that many Israelis know very well, that in the Middle East, the difference between a monologue and a dialogue is that whereas in the case of monologue, there is one person talking to himself, in the case of dialogue, there are two persons talking to themselves. So dialogue is a great thing, provided there is something behind it that says, if you don't reach an agreement with me, it will not be only intolerable to me, it will also be intolerable to you. And you need to do it not only in order to deter the radicals, but also in order to give motivation to the moderates who need to explain to the Arab street why they are willing to acquiesce with the existence of the State of Israel. When Mubarak was asked, why don't you make war against Israel, a few years ago, he didn't say because we have peace and we got everything we wanted. He said because you know what the outcome of war will be for Egypt. So if you can't do it to explain to your own people, even the moderates cannot pursue the policy that they would have wanted to pursue. From the point of view of looking at the international communities that is so dear to the Europeans, international institutions, particularly the United Nations, is controlled by anti-Israeli forces. The operative numbers are 22, 58, 140. 22 Arab states, 58 Muslim states, 140 states of non-aligned or third world or what you want that vote together. So it is something that from an Israeli point of view not only cannot be fair, but cannot be anything but hostile. So expecting the international community to determine what Israel will do means, from an Israeli point of view, actually committing suicide. And what I'm saying is that these differences are so deep that each side is digging in. There is no real dialogue on this level of the value and cultural level. And for the Europeans, what you have here is a question of identity. Believing in the international community, believing in proportionality when it comes to response is not a position, is not a policy. It is part of the essence, of the core of European identity. And for the Israelis, it is perceived as the core of their existential interests. And therefore, I don't see them convincing each other. Let me present what I think is a European perspective and then an Israeli perspective, again, deepening what we've discussed so far. A European perspective, and let me again stress, I'm not speaking about European governments and I'm not speaking about bilateral relations. I'm speaking about the European elites. I'm speaking about the public discourse. I'm speaking not about what perhaps an Israeli prime minister and a British prime minister will be discussing in a closed room, but about what is happening in public and what the elites actually, the kind of atmosphere that the elites in Europe create, that European policymakers must take into account. I've heard at least 4 times in major European countries from people very high up in the government, we would have pursued another policy were it not for the fact that we know that we will lose our legitimacy vis-à-vis our own elites. What I'm about to discuss now is not something that is the official policy, but is the kind of atmosphere within which European governments need to work. The perception is that Israel, by its contempt to the international community, is undermining the world order where the Europeans want to be those who bestow legitimacy, and they see their role in the world today working through the international community where they bestow legitimacy on others. When the Israelis have contempt to it and show that they can work against it and get away with it, they undermine something that is very serious, that is very difficult for them. Israel must constantly defy what is called the consensus of the international community because it is molded under circumstances that are so unfriendly and very often hostile to Israel. You can hear very often in Europe that Israel is going against the course of history by, for instance, building walls rather than tearing them down, by not seeking regional integration. Europeans very often say, we've done it in Europe, why can't you do it in the Middle East, disregarding the enormous difficulty and the suicide that will be if Israel, God forbid, becomes part of the Middle East in any sense that the Middle East is today. In other words, I don't think Israelis would like to be as open-minded as Syria, as technologically advanced as Yemen, as open to women's rights as Saudi Arabia. Israelis look around in the Middle East and they don't see very much that they would want to become a part of. To equate it with Europe, you know, we integrate in our region, why don't you? We have done it, why can't you do it? When you hear this, Israelis will not really take it very seriously. And in the very extreme cases, this is not typical of the mainstream, but it's there constantly, speaking about Israeli colonialism, Israeli apartheid, or pursuing policies of colonialism and apartheid. The European narrative, and again, I'm speaking about these elites, is we used to have in Israel a peace government, and it pursued a European process, namely the Oslo process, starting on the European assumption that you deal with your enemies as equals and you give them an opportunity and you see what happened. And then Rabin was assassinated, and since then the right wing is in government, and there is in Europe, and unfortunately also in some circles in the United States, a need to describe Israel in a way that is totally detached from reality, as if it is dominated by the radical right wing with strong fascist elements. The problem very often in Europe and some circles in the United States is people read Haaretz and they confuse it with Israel. They think that there is some relationship between the way Haaretz describes Israel and Israel. It used to be the case until a few years ago when Haaretz was a very critical newspaper. Today we're speaking about a radical newspaper. And then Israelis who have a different view, particularly those in the left and the deep left, are considered in Europe very often as dissidents, as people who bravely fight against these terrible circumstances in Israel, and they represent democracy, and Europe must help those Israelis save Israel in spite of itself from these trends that are presented as the trends of Israel. But actually, the major shift in European public opinion vis-à-vis Israel did not come with the assassination of Rabin, it came with defensive war, namely 2002 and 2004. And what you have in Europe, what you had at the time, and you still have remnants of it, was not so much the anger on the fact that Israel oppressed the population in order to root out terrorism as it was presented in Europe, but the outrage that it worked. The outrage in Europe that it worked because it undermined very important parts of the European ethos. First of all, it worked. I mean, these Israeli actions brought down terrorism by 98%. I mean, beyond what the greatest optimists could expect. So the European notion of, if you want to deal with terrorism, go to the root causes of terrorism, which is a euphemism for capitulate to terrorists, was totally rejected by Israel, and it worked. What Israel totally rejected proved to be very successful. It's even worse because Israelis don't have guilt, but a great sense of satisfaction. Europeans are also outraged that the United States is defending Israel and makes it possible for Israel to get away with it, even when the United States has a very European president, and that Israel can ignore Europe politely, but basically ignore Europe when it comes to setting its policy. I think this is unacceptable to the elites, to the ideologues, and also to the bureaucrats of the EU. In the American sense, you may remember a very interesting article where Robert Kagan borrowed the name of a book and said that Europeans are from Venus, Americans are from Mars. And I think that from a European point of view, you could say, stretching it a little bit, Europeans, no.
Yes. It's after
Wow,
9:30.
Okay, I wanted
wanna
half
make
an
sure
hour.
and you're going to get it. Just want to make sure there's plenty of time for
Okay.
questions and answers.
Okay, so I'll try to adjust myself to it to some extent. From a European point of view, you could say Europeans are from Venus, Americans are from Mars, and Israelis are from planet Rambo. So this perception, particularly after the wall, was a very serious problem. You need to show that there is something profoundly wrong with what Israel did, that it is not part of the open society as the Europeans would like to see it, and therefore you have to, again, come to describe Israel in a way that doesn't reflect what Israel is, as going to the extreme right. Let me give a very short description, because I have very little time, about the Israeli perspective, and then come to my conclusion. What Israelis say about Europeans is more or less the following, and I'm stretching it a little bit, particularly because I don't have the time to go into the explanation, but I will be delighted to be more specific in the Q&A. First, the Europeans don't understand what's happening in the Middle East. If you want a good example, look at what they did in Libya, or saying that Assad is a man of peace that Israel should be dealing with, and so on. I don't think there is in Israel much respect for what Europeans understand concerning the Middle East. Second, you can never trust Europeans. I must admit, I've been to many meetings where these issues were discussed on the highest level. I don't remember anybody who ever brought up the option that you can trust Europe when it comes to the security of Israel. Israelis remember very well how, when Israel was weak and dependent on Europe, Europe betrayed Israel in 1967 with the embargo of de Gaulle, in 1973 when Europe did not allow American aircraft to refuel in Europe on their way to help Israel when the Egyptians were getting massive support from the Soviet Union. Their perception of, Israeli perception of Europeans as ones that can help in security arrangements was never very high, but it became even lower when Europeans just fled from the Gaza Strip when they were supposed to have a security role. There is a perception that at best the European ideas about a settlement are naive, and the most important thing, and that's the one thing I still want to introduce in spite of the time limit, and this is that the Europeans de facto, not that they mean it, not that they want it, not that the governments are committed to it, but by the European behavior, particularly in international organization, They're helping the political war against Israel. And it is masquerading as a struggle against the Israeli occupation, but it is basically delegitimizing Israel. Now, there is a major discussion if this is true or untrue, but that this is the perception of the overwhelming majority of Israelis, in spite of those who want the Europeans to force Israel to do the extreme opposite of what mainstream Israelis want. This I can say with absolute certainty. That the Europeans are perceived as having a double standard, that they're moralizing in a way that they have no place to do, that they legitimize by their very participation, by abstention or agreement, but even by abstention, they legitimize what is happening in international organizations, particularly in the United Nations, when there is a war against the legitimacy of Israel, support NGOs that undermine this legitimacy, even if they claim to support just certain activities of the NGOs, and these activities do not undermine it. If you look at what the NGOs are doing, it's a very serious problem. And that if you have today a European solidarity, it is at the expense of Israel. In other words, when in the United Nations, Europeans vote, Europe votes as one bloc against Israel, or abstains in a way that de facto is against Israel, even very friendly countries to Israel, like the Czech Republic, will go along because they don't want to be out of the European consensus. So the European consensus works in this direction. Let me just mention the last thing, and then I'll use one of the questions, no matter what you ask, in order to elaborate on it. The Israeli perception is, if we will listen to Europe, we will not exist, okay? And here is the last point that I want to make, and I'm sorry I didn't have time for a little more. Israelis vis-à-vis Europe have a very serious problem, but they don't have a dilemma. They have a very serious problem because they know the Europeans are already taking steps that are putting Israel in a difficult position on the international arena. They have a very serious problem because they realize that Europe can hurt Israel a lot, and sometimes tries to demonstrate that it can hurt Israel a lot so that it is not ignored. They know that it's a serious problem, but they have no dilemma whatsoever. Because the Israeli perception, and I think this reflects a very large portion of the Israeli mainstream, is if we listen to the Europeans, we are doomed. Had we listened to the Europeans, we would not have done the defensive shield that we did in 2002, 2004, and nobody could live in Israel today because terrorism would have destroyed Israel had we gone the way that Europeans would condone. Certainly the Syrians, perhaps the Iraqis, would have been in a position to build nuclear weapons had we listened to the Europeans. I'm not even sure we would have had a peace with Egypt, because the whole idea of a separate peace that disregards the Palestinians would have been unacceptable to the Europeans. We would not have had the most effective deterrent force against terrorism, which is targeted killings, if we would have listened to the Europeans. So if you go, and there are quite a number of other examples, if you go to the consensus of mainstream Israelis, the idea is the option of listening to Europe is simply not there. You can try to be polite to the Europeans, you can try here and there to adjust yourself to them. You need to bring down the very unpleasant situation where you clash very often. You need to soften it down, but, and this is my last comment here, what you can achieve is not a solution of the problem, not even a dramatic improvement of it, but damage control. In other words, since the Europeans have no motivation to change their views, and since the Israelis have no motivation to change their behavior, since the Europeans will not abandon their perception of international community and proportionality and the use of force and so on, because it's part of their identity. And the Israelis will not abandon their approach from using force for deterrent reasons, we cannot see in the near future anything that will eliminate the problem or reduce it to a level that will make it easy to live with. The only thing that can be done is damage control. Israelis could give up a number of things that they consider not vital but don't agree with the European perception. They can give it up, but they can't go very far.
Dan, thank you very much. Let me take advantage of my role as moderator to ask the first question. I do not believe that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is central to Middle East peace, security, and stability, nor do I believe that the prospects of a conflict-ending solution are available right now. But in the category of counterfactuals, and here's my question, because I don't want to remove Israel, make Israel as a piece of driftwood, sort of, adrift on an angry sea. Israel has agency. It has the capacity to act and improve its own situation. So here's my question. In the event, Dan, that there were to be a conflict-ending solution of the Israeli-Palestinian problem, it's one piece of the Middle East puzzle, all right? I'll grant you it is not central, given the dysfunction in the region. But should there be such a solution, do you believe that there would be any moderation, amelioration in the relationship between Israel and Europe? Or, to listen to your analysis, would the structural factors, the suspicion, the mistrust, the traditional attitudes of European elites just trump this new reality?
First of all, there will not be an agreement between
I got
Israelis
that.
and Palestinians.
No, I understand that, but
among other things,
I'm trying to get at something important here.
I know.
Which is, does Israel have agency in the way it is viewed in the world? Or is it, and will it remain, a kind of structural us versus them paradigm for time immemorial? That's my broader question.
I understood the question, and I would like to answer it in a systematic way. Short, but systematic. Namely, there will not be an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, among other reasons, because the Palestinians know they can always rely on the Europeans. And I think that even if that miraculously would happen, and by the way, the impact of it on the Middle East will be marginal, if not negligible, but even if it will be achieved, I don't think anything substantial will change between Israel and Europe. This is what you're asking. And the reason is the Europeans already today are supporting in Israel all the Arab NGOs that consider the very existence of the Jewish state not only as Israel being born in sin, but existing in sin, and can only be legitimized if it turns from a Jewish state to an Arab state through the right of return. And once we will settle the Palestinian issue, which we won't, but just to please you, once the Palestinian issue is settled, it doesn't really matter very much. A, because there'll always be more radical Palestinians, and they'll use terrorism. And when they use terrorism, Israel will respond. And when it will respond, it needs to be deterrent. And then it will be disproportionate. And then the United Nations will adopt anti-Israeli decisions, and the Europeans will abstain or vote for it. And I don't see anything that will change in this regard. By the way, from 1993 until today, for 20 years, Israeli policies have changed dramatically in the direction of being more moderate. I mean, what do you... the positions of Benjamin Netanyahu today go further than the positions of Rabin in 1993. Did it make the relationship between Israel and Europe better? The Israeli acceptance of the right wing in Israel accepting a Palestinian state, did that improve the relations with Israel, between Israel and Europe? It only made them worse. Okay, but again, I'm not speaking about European governments, I'm speaking about these elites.
Okay. To your questions, please identify yourselves. Joe.
How serious is this boycott, sanctions of Israel, and where is it going? And I assume it will be going to the United Nations eventually.
It's a problem, and the problem of it is, again, not that some radicals have initiated it, but that Europe indirectly makes it easier for the radicals to work, although the Europeans don't support what they're doing. Because if the Europeans are having a boycott on the settlements, and it fits into a broader trend, I'm trying to, not to discuss just the BDS in itself, but to put it in the setting that we're discussing here, it makes the question a legitimate question. So will it be there? Yes. Is it based on the worst double standard that you can imagine? Yes, including, by the way, the European attitudes vis-à-vis the settlements. If you compare it to the European attitudes about Morocco and Western Sahara, or about India and Kashmir, or other, the northern part of Cyprus and so on. So is it a problem that will be with us? Yes, I believe that it will strengthen in Europe. I think there is a ceiling to how much it will be successful here in the United States. I think here it will have a limited success. In Europe, it will have a broader success. And it's a problem that Israel will have to deal with, along with many other problems.
Yes, over here. Mike.
Dan, as you know, I go back to before the '67 war, when I was a very young editor on the Middle East desk when UPI, when it was a big outfit, and a lot of the dispatches coming in from the Middle East. And I was kind of struck a bit by the cultural differences. I wondered to what extent you think a lot of this goes back to World War II, where the Europeans drew different lessons, the need to accommodate each other, try to make a rapprochement, I mean, even between the French and the Germans, etc., with Israelis learning another lesson that, you know, they have to depend upon themselves. And also, and again, this goes back to being in Europe during the Vietnam War too, during part of it, how much of it, the European attitude reflects a certain amount of anti-Americanism among some of the European elites, especially the British and the French.
Well, first it goes back to the First World War, not just to the Second World War. I believe that the profound crisis in Western civilization, if you want the most important event in Western civilization in modern times, it's the Great War 100 years ago. And part of the European elites since that point came to the conclusion that under no circumstance, war is the worst thing and the use of force is the worst thing and so on. And one of the reasons that we had the Second World War to begin with was, again, these European elites, and we could have lost the Third World War, namely the Cold War, if we would have listened to the European elites, and you would not have an American deterrence in Europe vis-à-vis the Soviet Union. And these same European elites, only now it's a much broader set, but these same European elites who were not willing to fight for king and country before the Second World War, and were not willing to have intermediate-range American missiles in Europe in the Cold War, are exactly the same elites, only now they're much broader because things have changed. The definition of what a liberal is have changed in a very considerable way since the 1990s, and particularly since the 1960s, and particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Concerning the Second World War, you very often hear in Europe this idea that we've learned how terrible it is to have wars and to use force, so our lesson from the Second World War is never use force. Now, again, not all, but it's very prevalent among European elites. The lesson that I think should be learned from the Second World War is that the good guys should use a lot of force as early as possible against the bad guys, otherwise the bad guys will force them to use much more force later. So this is, again, a cultural difference, a very deep cultural difference that you have between Europeans and Israelis, and by the way, also between Europeans and Americans. Now, at the moment, European-American relations are relatively good because you have a European president in the United States. So the Europeans feel much better than before. But if you go back to an American president who reflects the difference, the profound difference in Weltanschauung between Europeans and Americans, I believe that this will rise again.
Yes, on the left.
Hi, my name is Stefan Groby. I'm the Washington correspondent of Euronews, which is the biggest European news channel. And I'm not sure I'm recognizing myself in what you said or recognize Europe in what you said. I just have two little questions. First, you speak of Europe in very, very general terms. Are you speaking about the European Union or parts of it or Western Europe? Or more precisely, when you talk about a rising anti-Semitism, where exactly do you detect this in countries like Poland, Hungary, or because I don't see it, frankly. And second point, are you comfortable with the support coming from American evangelical Christians of Israel, those who want Israel and its biblical borders? Thank you.
Let me very shortly answer the second question, because I don't think it's within the mainstream of our discussion here, but just to get it off the table, I'm grateful for any support of Israel. We are not in a position where we can be choosers. And I very strongly disagree with their view about the Greater Israel. My own political conviction is that Israel should unilaterally, and this is something that I'm promoting for a few decades now, that Israel should unilaterally get out of the overwhelming majority of the territories that we occupied in 1967, including repartitioning of Jerusalem. So do I like the policies of everybody who may support me? No, but I don't think it belongs to our discussion here. If you don't recognize what I've said here in European media, I would suggest that you watch them more closely. If I watch, for instance, the BBC or listen to the BBC, let me give you an interesting example. A few years ago, I listened to the BBC. They had a program and they said, well, after discussing so much the element of terrorism and its political implications, let us now discuss the human suffering resulting from terrorism. And I said, hey, something new, something interesting. There is also a human dimension in it, and not just liberation fighters who have been forced to do these things. And then it turns out that the program was about a mother that feels lonely because her son exploded himself in an Israeli bus, killing 20 Israeli civilians, and she feels that she's lonely because she wants her son back, but she explains that she supports him doing so, and she's proud of what he did. So this is the human suffering of the mother who supported her son killing 20 innocent Israelis, and she feels lonely for him. But this is an extreme case, but you have a lot of elements, and here is also where the anti-Semitic element comes in. It is not that the motivation is primarily anti-Semitic. I stressed it a number of times. This is not the issue. The issue is that when you express anti-Israeli views, you very often go to the images, to the original images of anti-Semitism. To give you a good example, we speak about the defensive war, 2004, 2002, 2004. This is when it was at its peak. And you get the Independent newspaper with a cartoon called Sharon Eating Babies, which is exactly the notion of the blood libel, how Jews enjoy drinking the blood of children, of non-Jewish children, and you have the exact blood libel. Okay, one newspaper can make one mistake, but then all British cartoonists get together and vote it to be the best cartoon of the year. So it is something, and I can bring hundreds of more examples of what we've seen in Europe. So this element is very, very strongly there. There was another part to your question that I forgot.
You said that anti-Semitism was on the rise in Europe. Can you come up with 3 examples from Great Britain? Is this the country where...
I'm sorry, yes, this was the part about different European countries. Yes, let me address this. There is a major difference between different countries in Europe. For instance, in Eastern Europe, there is today much less of this kind of accusation of Israel, not just the anti-Semitic part. I'm speaking about the difference in ethos. It is not at all present in the Czech Republic. It is not very much there in Eastern Europe. It is primarily in Western Europe. Because of the brevity, because we need to squeeze a lot of things into a very short time, I couldn't get into the difference. But the British elite, the German elite are very often very extreme on these issues, also the French. It's more Western Europe than Eastern Europe. But when it comes to the political action that is a product of this ethos, then European solidarity brings in European countries who would not like to vote this way, but this is the perception that you get in Brussels. This is the pressure that is put on the individual states. And then when they vote, for instance, to give you only one example, the International Court in La Hague took a decision against the Israeli fence that they called wall. And it says, among other things, that Israel doesn't have a right of self-defense because of some strange, if we had more time, I would give you the full text, a strange distortion of the text of the Charter of the United Nations. And then the Europeans vote for it, just saying that it's true that countries have a right to defend their citizens, but basically they vote for a resolution that undermines the Israeli right of self-defense. Now, even if they say we don't agree with this particular part, they then vote with a resolution that undermines the ability of Israel. Had we listened to it, it would have destroyed the ability of Israel to deal with terrorism. So the problem is not that they take a position that is hostile to Israel, but that they enable processes that make self-defense of Israel extremely difficult, if not impossible.
We have a few minutes left. How many questions? Let's take a couple questions at a time.
Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. Short question, maybe a long answer, I don't know. Most people who look at the Arab-Israeli situation always begin with the premise that there were two great wrongs which caused our problem, obviously, dating back from the Holocaust. And of course, it's the Germans who were maybe the bad guys. But having put that, there's nothing in your presentation that appears to give any respect for the Arab position. Without reviewing it, we don't have time, it's fairly clear where they're coming from, you know, the usurper and so on. Do you at all include it? Do you realize that Israel still is in a sea of 100 million, 150 million people, that it does go against basic Arab trends and so on? I, for one, always make sure in my positions, always say, this is Israel, this is Arabs, how do we put it together? We need a Sadat. Thank you.
That's one, okay. Yes, on the right.
Bob Lieber, Georgetown.
Hey, Bob.
Does time work for or against Israel?
This is a question. First of all, let me address Professor Lieber's question. First of all, this is a question that I will be discussing in Georgetown on the 28th of this month at 6 o'clock in the evening. And I will not do it justice if I give a very short answer here, but just one element of it. Israel is today not only having serious problems, but the problems that are much more complicated than the ones that we've had in the past are yet not as difficult as the problems we've had in the past. And this distinction is extremely important. And at the same time, Israel is today dramatically stronger than 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So if you compare the problems that Israel is facing today, that are complicated, but not as difficult as they used to be, and you bring in the fact that Israel is today very much stronger than it was in the past, I think our chances to deal with the challenges in the future are much better than ever before. If this represents who does time work for, then it's a partial answer. But again, it's a very complicated question, and I want to deal with it systematically and to do justice to it. Concerning the first question, first of all, we're not facing 100 million Arabs, we're facing 350 million Arabs, so, and others who support them. Second, not every question has to bring in the Arabs. We're discussing Israeli-European relations, and when you discuss Israeli-European relations, you bring in the Arabs as part of the problems that Europeans and Israelis are dealing with. As if you would discuss European-Arab relations, you would bring Israel as part of the problems that Arabs and Europeans are discussing. So I don't see a need every time one speak about any subject to bring in the Arab narrative of the Arab-Israeli conflict. There was another element there that I forgot. Just remind me.
In this world, you always need a concept. You need a vision of where you're heading. I heard nothing in your speech about a vision that can come out of Israel in terms of resolving the problem. I don't accept your argument about the Arabs. As long as you have an Arab problem, the Israelis and the Europeans are talking, but I don't know. But isn't there a vision? There's nothing that comes out of Europe that I could put into
Well, first, I apologize for not being a visionary. And second, it is very interesting that I don't think you've asked the same questions about any other country. When you come to listen about the relations between, I don't know, China and Africa, would you bring up the question, what is the vision of China? Okay, so here, let me put it this way. From an Israeli point of view, first of all, survival is a very important vision to begin with. And second, the vision of Israel is not something that concerns the Arabs. You have to bring about a settlement between Israelis and Arabs so that Arabs can accept Israel. If they will, fine. If they won't, Israel will still exist even if the Arabs don't like it. Israel lives in the Middle East and needs to have the Arabs accept it if they're prepared to do so. And if they're not prepared to do so, then to wait until they are prepared to do so because they don't have any other choice. The idea that you need to sit there and wait for others to love you or to support you just so that you can legitimize your continued existence is completely alien to me in every context, not just the context of Israel.
Dan, thank you very much, and thank all of you. This forum is part of the Gildenhorn Forum series, and I want to again thank Alma and Joe for supporting it, and thank all of you for coming.
Thank you. I get this very seldom.